Hey, this is Art from My New Microphone, and today I want to discuss phase and its importance in mix preparation. Now, if we can get the phase relationships between our tracks right and working together before we start ever pushing faders or processing, we'll have a much easier time mixing our songs. On the contrary, if we fail to get these phase relationships right before we start mixing, we will never really reach our mix potential and perhaps even work on projects that are virtually unmixable. So phase is important, and in this video, I'd like to talk about it. Starting with a basic definition, phase refers to the amount that a wave has passed through its waveform cycle. So if we take our basic sinusoidal or sine wave, which represents a single frequency, if we take that wave in positive polarity, we will start at zero amplitude at 0 degrees, move through to the positive maximum amplitude at 90 degrees, back down to zero amplitude at 180 degrees, down to maximum negative amplitude at 270 degrees, and then back up to zero amplitude at 360 degrees, or we could also call that 0 degrees of the following cycle. Now, when we're dealing with sound and audio, we typically aren't dealing with simple sine waves with a single frequency. Rather, we're dealing with complex sounds and audio waveforms that have multiple frequencies and don't necessarily repeat. However, this idea of phase being from the beginning of the waveform and moving through the waveform will still apply and works as a good foundation for the topic we'll be discussing today. Now, when we're dealing with a mix, it doesn't really concern us what the phase of any individual track is at any given time. And what I mean by this is if we're only looking at a track in isolation, it doesn't matter when it starts or ends, when its waveform is positive or negative or anything like that. Rather, what we are concerned with is the relationship between the different tracks. And the best way to exemplify this is, again, to revisit our sine wave example. So if we have two sine waves, identical waveforms, that are completely in phase, we will have both waveforms going from 0 up to positive maximum amplitude together, coming back down through 0, going to maximum negative amplitude together, and then coming back up to 0. In this case, both waves will sum together and effectively double the amplitude of the mix. On the contrary, if we have two sine waves that are completely out of phase, this means that when one duplicate of the signal is at its maximum positive peak, the other will be at its maximum negative peak, and vice versa. When we sum these two together, we have absolute silence at the output. Now, this is an oversimplified statement of phase. It's not really how it works with complex waveforms and the like. However, it works as a strong basis or foundation to build upon when we're discussing phase relationships in the mix. Now, when dealing with phase relationships and phase cancellation, we have to pay special attention to low-end frequencies, which have much longer waveforms and are therefore much more affected by any big differences in phase. And additionally, we want to pay special attention to transient information, that is claps, snares, kicks, anything that has a sharp peak followed by a rapid drop-off in amplitude. We will want to ensure that any microphones or audio tracks that have strong transient information kind of align with each other so that they aren't canceling each other out. Doing so will give us strong bass response in the low-end frequencies and punchy percussive elements in the mix when done on transients. Conversely, not getting the phase relationships right can lead to a very thin low end in a mix without much power, and it can really kill rhythm and transient information throughout the track. High-end frequencies, on the other hand, are one, very difficult to do anything about because they move so rapidly. They're constantly going in and out of phase with each other. And second, our ears don't perceive these phase cancellations as strongly as they do with low frequencies where they are much more obvious to us. So we want to pay special attention to phase relationships of low-end elements and transient elements, and we don't really want to give too much effort to making phase relationships perfect in the mid-range and upper range because, again, there's not a whole lot we can do about it, and two, it doesn't really affect our hearing that much in the mix. So with that introductory discussion, I'd like to now jump into our digital audio workstation and show you how a little bit of mix preparation in Phase can help with the final results of a mix. So let's do that. All right, so now we are inside Logic Pro, where I can really show you how phase relationships will ultimately affect a mix. Now, we discussed how phase relationships really affect percussive elements like drums. So we have drums here, and bass elements like bass guitar, which we have right here. So let's solo the bass guitar to begin with to show you how phase relationships can affect the low end of a mix. So if we zoom in, this is where phase comes into play. We have to actually look deep inside the audio files right here. So if we really zoom in, I can even bring this up a little bit. We have, and I did this on purpose before starting just to show you what's going on. So the 57 track starts well before the 52 track. And then when the 52 goes out or goes negative, the 57 goes positive. You see that? And then vice versa. When the 52 goes positive, we have the 57 going negative. So if we listen to this, it's going to sound a little bit thin. We'll still be able to hear it. It'll still have tone, but it may be a bit thin. And the reason being that the low end frequencies, which are well represented here in the audio file, are out of phase with each other. Now, they're not perfectly out of phase because that would lead to absolutely no audio being output, but they are somewhat out of phase. And by somewhat, I mean they're pretty out of phase. So one test to listen to hear if things are really out of phase or not is to actually flip the phase or flip the polarity of one of the signals and listen to if it makes it sound better or if it makes it sound worse. Does it really fill out the low end if we flip the phase, or does it not? So in this case, when I flip the phase here, we should hear a lot more low end because we'll be flipping this audio so that when this is positive, it'll actually be negative and vice versa. So it'll much better align with this other track right up here, the 52. So I'll play this back and I'll toggle the phase invert on and off. So you can hear when the phase is inverted that it sounds a lot fuller in the low end, and it sounds really much more thin when the phase is not inverted. Now, phase inversion is, or polarity flipping, it's a matter of semantics, is an effective strategy when you are dealing with phase issues. What I prefer, and it's a much more visual way of doing it, is by actually nudging the audio. So let's actually get rid of this plugin. We'll bypass it for now. And I'll actually grab all of the bass here, zoom in. And these were recorded from the same take, so they are going to line up throughout the entirety of the song. It's not like I pieced together different takes here. So if we drag this over, let's try to line it up so that we are as in phase as possible. So here they'll start a little bit differently, but then let's bring that over a little bit. You can really see the waveform as you zoom in. So we may want to mess around a little bit, but that looks pretty good to me. Now, if we listen back, there will be a much more solid low end. If we undo our movements here, it's thin. Now, if we redo, So that's just to show you how a little bit of phase shift can really bring out the low end of low end elements. Now, this doesn't really have anything to do with timing. You may think, oh, if I'm nudging something, well, I'm going to change the time. And that is true more so on the macro movements, but not so much on the micro movements. So let's say if I was to move this track here, then that would be a timing difference. But when I'm doing something as subtle as just moving a few samples to realign these waveforms phase-wise, then that doesn't really alter the timing of the track, but will pay dividends when it comes time to mix by just having really good phase relationships between the two. So that is good for bass. Now let's move on to the drums. So when dealing with drums, I always like to start with the overheads. And particularly, the overheads are going to capture a lot of snare. The snare is the most transient drum that the overheads will pick up the most often. So I like to go to my overheads and my snare and just make sure that they're nice and aligned before getting into the mix. So if we zoom in on any of these snare drums right here, again, this is all recorded together, so any movements of one track will hold true throughout the entirety of the song. So if we zoom in here, we see that, just as I would probably expect, we have the snare drum reaching the close mic first, and then it hits the overhead left mic before the overhead right mic. You can see that in the waveforms here. So essentially, the snare drum is hit, and the close mic of the snare drum picks up the signal first because it's closest to the snare, and then the overhead left will pick it up right after. And then because the overhead right is just a little bit further away, it'll pick up the snare drum a little bit after. So what we can do here is actually, well, let's listen first. Now, the differences are going to be subtle, but mixing is a game of small changes, it's a game of inches, as they say. So any small changes will really help us in the ending. Okay, now if we go in here and really pay attention to line up the phase, can do something like that. And then we can also bring over the right overhead to match up. So now we have pretty much all the peaks happening at the same time, and then they all go negative and then positive, and then the overheads are picking up much more of the overall kit, so their waveforms are going to look quite a bit different. But just a simple change like that can really help tie together the phase and tie together the entirety of the drum kit. If we undo these moves, we'll undo again. And we'll redo the movements. So it's subtle, but it definitely helps out. And we'll go look at another hit right here, and we see that, yes, the waveforms are definitely different, and they will be different every time the snare is hit. However, we really help tie in the phase between these three elements. Now with the overheads, they will pick up a little bit of kick drum. However, it's not really of major concern here because the kick is so faint in these overheads that it's not really going to kill the transients of the kick drum itself, because the kick drum is further removed from the overheads than the snare drum. But similar to the snare drum, we have the overheads picking up the tom drums. So what we can do here is zoom in on the toms and just move them as well into phase, and particularly paying attention to the beginning of the transients here. So you can see that the tom drum microphones pick up the tom drums well before the overheads did. But yeah, if we do that, then we just have much better phase relationship between the overheads and the individual drum mics, and this will help in the mix by giving us much stronger transients to work with. Now, another thing worth mentioning here before I let you guys go is drum replacement. So if we have drum replacement going on, I believe it's Control D, and I'll just do the kick drum as an example. This is useful information if you're into hip hop and EDM and any other genres where you are regularly stacking or layering samples together, because you want the samples to work together rather than work apart. It also works with drum replacement technology, which I will show you here. So we'll only work on the kick just for example purposes. So we have drum replacement doubling, instrument kick. We'll hit OK. Now, if we go and solo the kick right here. Okay, that's good enough for our purposes. We will bounce this in place. And here we are with a kick drum that is replacing this kick. And oftentimes when I'm using drum replacement technology, I don't actually want to replace the kick drum. I just want to enhance it. So I'll usually bring the volume of this down and work together with the kick. So with that, it's important that we have proper phase here as well. So here we see that in MIDI, we couldn't see the audio, first of all. And when we actually bounce this out to audio, we see that it's a little bit iffy on the phase. So if we drag this back, we can get at least the initial transient to line up before going negative. And then we see here that it goes kind of way out of whack. So the first cycle, so to speak, is pretty good. And then we see here that it goes kind of haywire. So in this case, I may actually go back and find a better sample for this. But for the purposes of this video, I just wanted to show you an example of time where we would be layering samples together. So in this case, I probably wouldn't go ahead and do this. I would try to find a better sample that better resembles this waveform right here of the kick, because we can see that the kick drum pretty much looks the same wherever we go. So we want something that will help to bring that out rather than to work against it. Now, again, the initial transients sound or line up pretty well, so we can have a listen to this. And we can actually invert the polarity to get a better idea of if it's working against us or for us. So you'll hear when it's regular, not phase inverted, there's a little bit more attack, but when I invert the phase, there's a little bit more body. And that is also shown visually here, where we have the attack is very much in line, in phase, and then the body is very much out of phase. So these are just a few things to keep in mind before you start mixing. Just take a look at the phase relationships between your different tracks and make sure that they line up as good as you can make them line up, and you'll have a much better time mixing. All right, that concludes our discussion on phase and mix preparation for this video. I hope you take what you've learned and apply it to your own mixes, and let me know how it goes in the comments below if taking the time to really hone in on the phase relationships between the different tracks in your mixes helps or not. As always, I'd like to invite you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'll be working hard on producing many more videos to come and getting better at giving you guys the information you need. As always, there are free resources you can check out in the description box below. Once again, I would like to thank you for being here with me, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks.